How can a man keep a trading platform alive for 12 silent years and still be called too old guard by someone who never read a single line of its code? What happens when a new CEO fires the only person who truly understands the system that moves $500 million a day? And why did the same board that watched me escorted out by security call me back 3 days later, whispering that the whole firm was desperate? Before we dive deeper into this story, I have one small request. Please subscribe, drop a like, comment, and hit that hype button to boost this channel so more people can discover these incredible Reddit stories. My name is Victor Lane, and for 12 years, my work lived inside cold metal racks and silent lines of code while other people stood on stages and took credit for it. Every weekday morning, I walked through the revolving doors of our building, past the glass wall where someone had written big words like innovation and disruption, and went straight to the trading floor where the real noise lived. Rows of monitors showed moving numbers, charts, and blinking lights. Phones rang, people cursed softly under their breath, and someone always shouted about a market move like it was a personal attack. Under all that noise, my engine moved money. It took in orders from our clients, matched them, routed them, and confirmed them. And on a normal day, we processed about $500 million without a single dramatic story. When my system worked, nobody thought of me. That was the point. A safe plane is one that lands so smoothly you forget to clap. That morning, I checked the dashboards like I always did. Latency looked fine, error rates were flat, and our overnight batch jobs had finished ahead of schedule. The younger support guys nodded at me and moved aside so I could look at a particular screen. They still did that much, a small habit from years when I fixed their worst nights. I typed a few commands, looked at log files only I really understood, and felt that familiar quiet relief when everything looked boring. Boring meant safe. Boring meant families around the world would never know our name and never have to worry about their trades. Around 10, an internal email pinged every screen. Invitation to a town hall with the new CEO, Aurora Price. The subject line called it a vision session and promised big news about modernization. People on the floor joked that they hoped modernization meant better coffee machines. I just sighed and saved my work. We had a new leader, and that always meant speeches, slides, and someone using the word legacy like a dirty word. In the main presentation area, a big screen showed Aurora's face before she even walked in. When she appeared, the room shifted. She was the type of leader people notice right away. Perfect posture, bright jacket, confident steps, and a smile that looked built for cameras. She spoke about the future of the firm, about speed, cloud, digital transformation, partnerships. Her words were smooth and fast, like a pitch deck turned into a person. At first, I listened with a neutral face. I had seen new leaders come and go. They all liked big words and big gestures, and then they called my team when things broke. But then Aurora moved to a slide that said, "Breaking free from legacy." Behind her, an image showed old mainframes in gray, and then a bright cloud graphic in blue. She talked about old systems that held us back, old thinking that was too cautious, people who were scared to let go of what they built. She did not say my name, but the analysts around me turned their eyes toward my section for a second, then looked away. She said some people in the firm had built solid old engines, but had also built old habits, and those habits had to go. She laughed lightly when she said that. People laughed with her. The sound was polite and short, but I felt it. Later she spoke about a new vendor platform we would move to, much faster than planned because the market will not wait for us. She said the phrase old guard once, as a little joke, and said the firm needed less of that. It landed in the room like a quiet stone. I kept my face still and my arms folded. The engine she called old was the one that had carried them through flash crashes, sudden rate changes, and regulatory storms. Nobody in that room had to explain to a client why an order vanished. Nobody but me and my team. When the town hall ended, people lined up to ask her questions and be seen. I stayed back, watched everyone move, and then walked out. On the trading floor, Jonas, the head of product and strategy, held court at one of the standing desks. He waved his hands over a laptop slide deck, talking about frictionless execution and zero latency aspirations. A couple of younger analysts laughed when he joked that we would finally retire the old engine and let it go to a museum. When I walked past, Jonas nodded at me with a forced smile, the kind you give to someone you already decided is in the way. Later that day, I got a short calendar invite. 15 minutes with Aurora in her corner office. No subject line beyond quick sync on migration. That phrase, quick sync, usually meant a decision already made. Her office sat on one of the higher floors with floor-to-ceiling windows and a view of the river. Everything there was bright. White shelves, green plant, glass table, chrome lamp. I stood by a small round table while she looked at something on her screen. When she finally turned her chair, She did not ask me to sit. She said she wanted my view on the new platform. I spoke calmly about what I had seen in vendor tests so far. Not enough failover checks, some strange latency spikes during stress tests, incomplete documentation on order routing. I did not dramatize anything, I just explained that combining this new platform with our current risk setup without more testing could cause a wide freeze if something failed at the wrong point. She listened with her head slightly tilted, then said my concerns sounded like fear of change. She said that if we waited for perfect tests, we would never move. She said the vendor had promised us an aggressive timeline and had delivered for other firms. I explained that our flow, our clients, and our regulatory obligations were different, and that the old engine had safety layers built over many crises. She said the industry had moved past that old way of thinking. Then she opened an internal dashboard and showed me a migration timeline on the screen. The final cutover milestone sat much closer than I had expected. Her tone was light and smooth, but the message was firm. This was happening, and my job was to support it, not slow it. By mid-afternoon, the trading floor returned to its regular noise. Underneath the chatter, my system still did its work. Trades in, trades out, confirmation sent, logs written, latency controlled. On my break, I sat at a spare desk near the window and opened my personal email for a moment. A notification from LinkedIn caught my eye. The day before, I had written a small post during my commute. It was not an attack on anyone. I had simply reflected on how in finance, people love shiny front ends, but forget that the invisible systems keep the world from burning down. I wrote that experience in silent crisis prevention had value, even if nobody cut a ribbon for it. The post had a few likes from old colleagues and quiet engineers I had known for years. But now I saw comments from some newer names I recognized from our firm. One said that the old guard always believed they were irreplaceable. Another joked that if a system needed a single engineer to be stable, it was badly designed. A third comment said that anyone who bragged about never failing was hiding a lack of ambition. I read them slowly, not because they hurt deeply, but because they showed the new mood. People who had never spent a night in a server room, who had never taken a call from a regulator after a market glitch, felt safe joking about the people who had done those things. That evening, after the closing bell, a bunch of people from the product and sales teams headed to a downtown hotel bar for an industry meetup. I went mostly out of habit. In this line of work, if you never show your face anywhere, people forget you exist, and forgotten people have no voice when decisions come. The bar sat on the second floor, with a long counter, dim lights, and too loud music. Screens on the wall showed business news and sports. Jonas stood near a high table, holding a drink and talking to a small cluster of younger staff and a mid-level client. I approached, nodded, and listened. He was in full presentation mode. He talked about how we were finally moving off ancient in-house stuff and into a modern, scalable platform with our new CEO. The client asked about risk, about stability, about how we would handle the transition. Jonas said we had everything under control, that the new platform would be even more stable than the old one, and that our old engine had been good for its time. Then he laughed and said the phrase museum piece again. A couple of people glanced at me. One analyst smirked, then looked away like a kid caught staring at a teacher. Jonas turned to me and said in a smooth tone that my long years building the old engine gave them a good base to move from, but his eyes told a different story. I just replied that I wished the cutover plenty of luck and that stability should be the only star of the show. It was indirect resistance, and we both knew it. On the way home, on the train, I watched my reflection in the window. I looked like what I was, a middle-aged man in a plain shirt and jacket, carrying a worn laptop bag. No fancy brand, no loud watch, no designer shoes. If you passed me on the street, you would not guess that my work had quietly moved $500 million a day for years. You would not guess that traders in 3 time zones slept better because my system did not fall apart under stress. The city lights flickered across the glass, cutting my face into pieces. My phone buzzed with another notification from LinkedIn. Someone had responded to one of the mocking comments and defended my post, saying that people should listen to the ones who kept them safe. I did not know the person. It made me smile for a second, then fade back to neutral. Being defended by strangers felt nice, but it did not change what was happening in my own building. The next morning, I arrived earlier than usual. The trading floor was still half empty, lights dimmed, screens showing overnight data. I liked those quiet minutes before the chaos. I moved from station to station, checking logs, running quick health checks, making sure the old engine hummed along as usual. The new vendor environment sat on a separate set of systems, still in test mode, and I opened a console window to glance at its logs as well. There were little warning messages, small spikes, things that made me frown. Nothing huge yet, but like hairline cracks in a bridge. I made notes on a pad in small, neat writing. As screens around me lit up and more staff arrived, the noise grew again. Jonas walked by with a coffee in his hand, telling someone that the final migration timeline looked very aggressive, but that's how leaders move. I wondered if he understood that gravity does not care about leadership slogans when a structure fails. By late afternoon, I had been pulled into 2 short meetings to answer technical questions about data feeds and fallback paths for the new platform. Each time, I explained carefully where the old engine still carried critical weight and where the new system depended on it for now. Each time, someone took rough notes and promised to loop back. Nobody did. As I prepared to leave my desk for the day, one of the newer support engineers asked if I could look at a strange error message in a staging environment. We leaned over his screen together, and I traced the path of an order through multiple services until I saw the same pattern as before: reliance on parts of the old engine without proper safety checks. I explained quietly what he should do for now, a temporary patch, and then I straightened up to leave. At that moment, a small notification in the corner of his screen popped up from our internal calendar system. It was an automatic reminder from a shared project calendar he was subscribed to. The title of the event hit my eyes like a cold light: Final Cutover. 3 days. Under it, a line of text said all hands. War room and celebration, location, executive boardroom. The engineer clicked it away without thinking, more worried about his error message. I did not say anything. I just looked at the spot where the notification had been, then at the date stamp on the screen. 3 days. They were really going to do it that fast. The engineer thanked me for my help and turned back to his logs. I walked away slowly, listening to the low hum of the machines and the distant echoes of voices on the trading floor, and for the first time in a long time, the system's quiet did not feel safe anymore. When I got home that night, the house was quiet except for the low hum of the fridge and the soft sound of a game coming from the living room. My son, Oliver, sat cross-legged on the couch with a controller in his hands, his headphones around his neck instead of on his ears. He paused his game when he saw my face. He always did that, even when I told him he did not have to. I asked him about school, about homework, about his friend who always got into trouble during math class. He told me he had a group project due and that nobody wanted to do the boring parts, so he had ended up doing them himself. He laughed when he said it, but I heard the tiredness under the joke. I told him I understood more than he knew. While he talked, my mind drifted back 12 years, to the first time I walked into this firm. Back then, the trading floor looked different. Fewer screens, fewer big words on the walls, more people with deep lines under their eyes. I had been hired after a bad incident with an old third-party system. A glitch had left trades stuck for hours, and clients had screamed at us like we had stolen their houses. The board panicked. The old CEO panicked, and someone who remembered my work at another firm gave my name to them. They called me in and asked if I could build something that would not fail like that again. I told them nothing in this world is perfect, but I could design something that took failure seriously and treated it as a first problem, not an afterthought. They said they needed safety more than anything. Back then, they meant it. Those first years were long and dark. I spent nights in the server room, on a folding chair, watching logs scroll past like an endless waterfall of numbers and messages. The air was always cool and dry, filled with the smell of dust and metal. I drank too much bad coffee and wrote diagrams on whiteboards that nobody outside my team ever saw. I missed dinners at home. I missed school events. When Oliver was younger, there was a class play I promised him I would attend. That afternoon, a strange pattern started in the system we were replacing, and if we had not caught it, we would have had another freeze like the one that had brought me in. I called my ex-wife and told her I could not make it. She was angry, and she had every right to be. Oliver went on stage as a tree or a cloud without his father in the audience. Years later, he told me he did not remember that play clearly, but I did. I remembered every line of code I wrote instead. The firm praised me in the way companies praise people like me. There were no big public celebrations, no glossy videos, no interviews, but the first time my engine carried them through a wild market day without breaking, the then CEO shook my hand in a small room and said that my work had saved them. He called me a backbone. He said the company owed me. That promise faded over time like ink exposed to the sun. We added features, we added more clients, we added new modules. I trained younger engineers, people like Maya, who came in with fresh eyes and quick hands. I taught them not just where to click, but how to think about risk. They listened closely at first because they knew that if they made a mistake, the whole floor would feel it. As the years passed, the company changed. The old CEO retired, then the one after him left after a merger. Marketing teams grew bigger. We got a social media department. We started making shiny videos about our vision for the future, with slow shots of the city and fast shots of young people in glass rooms. They filmed on the trading floor once. They did not film in the server room. In one video, Jonas stood in front of a big screen and talked about our cutting-edge platform. He used my engine's name but never mentioned the people behind it. I was in the background, out of focus, checking a graph. When the video came out, someone in my team sent me the link and joked that I was now a movie star. In the comments, a stranger said the engine sounded impressive. Jonas replied that his team worked day and night to deliver that performance. His team, not ours. That was the pattern. Whenever something went wrong near the surface, when a trader clicked the wrong thing or a network line outside our control failed, my phone rang. It did not matter if it was midnight or 3 a.m. I answered, pulled on clothes, and drove in or logged in from my home office. I watched logs, traced errors, and kept the trouble from becoming headlines. When we succeeded, the report would say, "Issue resolved by operations and product teams." My name appeared on internal emails and ticket systems, not in speeches, but the board knew who to call when regulators requested explanations. They called me into small rooms with bad coffee and closed blinds. I spoke calmly, explained what happened, what we did, and how we would prevent it next time. Regulators nodded, clients calmed down, the firm smiled again, then forgot. Around the same time, a new kind of employee started appearing more often. They were young, loud, very online. They spoke in terms of stories, brands, and impressions. They used words like narrative and spotlight. They cared about how things looked more than how they worked. They were not bad people. They simply lived in a different world than I did. For them, a system that did not break was just expected. They assumed stable infrastructure was like running water, invisible and cheap. They believed the hard, clever work happened in slides and strategy decks. When these people got promoted, the structure of the firm shifted. Risk became something for a bullet list, not a lived experience. I remember one meeting in a smaller conference room a couple of years before Aurora came. A senior marketing manager wanted to promise instant trades in a new client campaign. She said modern users did not understand delays and that we needed to sound faster than our competitors. I explained that we could be very fast, but that markets and regulations sometimes required brief holds, checks, and confirmations. I said we should be honest and say we were fast and safe, not just fast. She rolled her eyes and said engineers always wanted to add boring words. Jonas backed her, saying that if we sounded slow, we would lose deals. They compromised by using the phrase near instant, which still made me nervous. Later, when the campaign worked, Jonas thanked marketing in a public email. My note about not overpromising ended up buried in an attachment nobody read. Slowly, respect became something you got from being seen, not from being reliable. New product ideas were announced with big screens and music. They fired confetti cannons once for a launch of a mobile app that barely worked in the first version. They never fired anything for 12 years of 0 major outages in the core engine. The joke on the floor became that if you wanted praise, you should break something first, then fix it loudly. If you kept it from breaking at all, people forgot you existed. That joke stopped being funny the longer I stayed. Of course, not everyone treated me badly. People like Martin, the CFO, knew the numbers behind the scenes. He once pulled me aside after a risk review and said, in his dry way, that the best line in his report was, "No loss due to system failure." He said if he could, he would frame that line. He never said it loudly in front of the flashier people, but I saw in his careful questions that he valued the boring safety my work gave him. And people like Priya at the big client fund trusted me because they had lived through the old failures before my engine. She once told me that she slept better when she knew I was still at the firm. She said it simply, like a fact, and then moved on. That was enough for me. The problem was that people like Martin and Priya were not the ones filling internal feeds or talking at town halls. The loud voices belonged to people who liked shiny dashboards and big claims. When Aurora arrived, she stepped into that culture and turned the volume even higher. Old guard became a phrase people used with a nervous smile, like a joke they were not sure they were allowed to say, but wanted to try. Legacy started appearing in memos next to phrases like clean slate. I started hearing my own work described as a weight rather than a shield. One evening, I came home later than planned after another round of planning sessions where my warnings had been nodded at and then gently brushed aside. Oliver sat at the kitchen table, his laptop open, a textbook beside it. He was working on some science assignment. I heated leftovers, and he asked if I could help him understand a part about structures and stress. The book used bridges as an example. It showed pictures of big metal bridges over rivers and explained how small cracks can grow over time if nobody checks them. I smiled and said I knew a bit about that feeling. I explained in simple terms how systems, like bridges, carry weight, and how that weight changes when people add more load or remove support beams. Oliver asked if that was like my job. I told him it was exactly like my job, just with money and data instead of cars. He asked if people at my work listened when I warned about cracks. I paused before answering. I told him they used to listen more. I told him that now a lot of people like to talk about how shiny the bridge looked, and sometimes they did not want to hear about the hidden bolts. He frowned the way he does when something seems unfair, but he is not sure how to say it. He said it seemed strange to him that someone could build a bridge, keep it safe for years, and then be treated like a problem for reminding people it needed care. I shrugged and said that was how some places worked now. After we finished with his homework, he put his pencil down and watched me rinse dishes at the sink. The kitchen light reflected off the window, and our faces floated faintly over the dark yard outside. Without looking at me, he asked a question in a quiet voice. He asked if a company like mine could just decide that someone like me was not shiny enough anymore and throw me away, even after all those years of keeping things from breaking. He asked if one day they might just decide that about him too, wherever he worked when he was older and not new. I stood there with my hands in the warm water and did not answer right away, because for the first time, I was not sure I could give him the comforting lie he wanted. The next week began with a feeling I could not quite name. It was not fear, not exactly. I had been through too many real crises to confuse this with that. It was more like the sense you get before a storm when the air goes still and you know something is coming, even if the sky is still clear. On Monday morning, an email from HR appeared in my inbox, polite and neutral. It invited me to a short meeting in one of their conference rooms to discuss my role in the new structure. That phrase, new structure, has never brought anyone a surprise raise. Still, I told myself not to jump ahead. I had seen restructures before. Sometimes they hurt people around the edges but left the core alone. I still believed, a little, that the engine I had built would be treated as core. The HR conference room was small, with beige walls and a table that was too big for the space. A framed poster on the wall talked about values and people being our greatest asset. I sat down on one side. Across from me sat an HR manager I barely knew, a polite man with careful hair, and Aurora herself, in another bright jacket and calm expression. The HR manager did most of the talking at first. He said there had been a review of roles as part of the modernization process. He said they had found overlaps and redundancies. He said my position as principal systems architect was being eliminated in the new model. While he spoke, Aurora watched me, not hostile, not kind, just watchful. When I asked if the work itself was disappearing, he said that some tasks would move to the vendor platform and some to a new internal team overseen by Jonas. I could tell from the careful way he read his notes that the decision was not his. Aurora then joined in, saying she appreciated my long years of service and the stability I had given the firm. She said the industry was changing and they needed different kinds of leadership now. She said she had seen my LinkedIn post about experience and that it concerned her. In her view, it sent a message that did not match the direction she was taking the company. She said it sounded like criticism of new approaches and that leaders could not afford to undermine each other in public. I had written that post on a train, thinking about silent work and invisible safety. I had not named anyone or any company. It was a general reflection. But in her mind, that reflection had become a signal of resistance. I thought about pointing out that her own speeches on openness and courage should include room for quiet thoughts about respect. Instead, I just said I had meant no attack, only a reminder that foundations matter. She smiled in a way that did not reach her eyes and said she understood that I might feel that way, but that perceptions mattered more than intentions. She used the phrase old guard again, this time directly, saying that in some places that mindset had value, but here it had become a barrier to change. When she stood up, the meeting did not end with a handshake. The HR manager handed me a folder with documents about my severance. The package was standard, nothing special for 12 years of never letting their core engine fail. Aurora said, in a smooth tone, that she wished me well and hoped I would find a place where my experience could be used in a way that aligned with modern needs. Then she nodded to the door. A security guard who had been waiting in the hall stepped in, not aggressive, just present. He said he would accompany me to collect my things. That was the part that felt like humiliation more than any words. The message was clear. I was no longer trusted to walk my own workplace without a watcher. On the way back to my desk, colleagues shifted their eyes. Some looked directly at me with open shock. Others pretended to be deeply busy with their screens. Maya stood near the end of our row, her hands on the back of her chair. Her face went pale when she saw the guard behind me. She asked softly if everything was all right. I told her HR had decided my role was no longer needed and that I would be leaving. I kept my tone calm. I did not raise my voice. The guard waited by the entrance to our area while I opened drawers, placed a couple of personal items in a small cardboard box, and logged out of my computer for the last time. I typed the commands slowly, letting my fingers feel the keys one last time. As I walked past the trading floor toward the exit, Jonas crossed paths with us. He looked surprised for a second, then recovered. He said that he was sure I would land on my feet and that this change was part of the natural evolution of things. He added that younger teams would take the platform to the next level. I did not argue. I simply replied that I hoped the next level would be stable enough to hold all the weight they planned to put on it. He laughed, a weak sound, and said I worried too much. The guard and I continued walking. At the security turnstiles, I placed my badge on the counter and watched the light go from green to red. Outside, the air felt colder than I remembered. The building's glass facade reflected the city and my own face back at me. For 12 years, I had come through those doors with the quiet knowledge that I carried responsibility for something important. Now, with one meeting and a short escort, that part of my life had ended. Or so they thought. I walked slowly down the street, the box under my arm feeling strangely light compared to the weight in my chest. By the time I reached the train station, my phone buzzed with messages from coworkers. Some were shocked, some angry, some cautious. A few said they were not surprised, that the new leadership had been looking for a way to push me out. At home, I put the box on the kitchen table and stood for a long moment with my hands resting on the edge. Oliver was not there yet, so the house was quiet. I carried the box to my small home office at the back of the house. The room was lined with shelves holding old manuals, printouts of system diagrams, and binders that most people would find boring. On the desk sat 2 monitors, a simple chair, and a worn notebook where I had scribbled thoughts over the years. I opened the box and placed each item on the desk: a framed photo from an early team celebration, a small coffee mug with a faded logo, a metal pen a grateful client had once given me after we saved them from a big loss. Then I opened the bottom drawer of my desk. Inside lay a folder I had not touched in years. Its edges were slightly bent from being moved during house cleanings. I pulled it out and placed it on the desk. The label on the front had my name and a date from more than a decade ago. I opened it and saw old patent documents, drafts, and correspondence with my own lawyer from before I joined the firm. Back then, I had designed an engine architecture and filed for patents under my own name. When the firm hired me, they did not buy the patents outright. Instead, we had written a licensing agreement that allowed them to use the design under certain conditions. At the time, everyone just wanted the system up and running. We signed, we moved on. Now, I read those terms with fresh eyes. The language was dense but clear enough. There were sections about safety standards, about redundancy, about oversight. The license assumed the system would be operated with specific layers of protection in place. Only under those conditions did I grant them broad use. If they removed those layers and ran something else under my architecture while still claiming its benefits, certain rights shifted back to me. I had never thought about those clauses as anything more than legal belt and suspenders. The company had always been cautious. We had built and kept those layers because we respected the risk. Seeing Aurora talk about ripping out legacy elements while racing onto a new vendor platform now gave those old words a different flavor. I closed the folder and sat back. My heart rate was steady. I did not feel like a man plotting revenge. I felt like someone finally seeing a pattern clearly. They had pushed me out, called me old guard, and rushed toward a launch that cut corners I had never allowed. In doing so, they might step outside the conditions under which they were allowed to lean on my work and my name. It was not something I would exploit recklessly. The system did not exist to be a weapon. It existed to keep money moving safely. But if they chose to ignore every warning and break every safety rule around it, I had the right, and maybe the duty, to protect myself and those who trusted me. The next day, Maya called and asked if I had time to meet. We chose a small street cafe a few blocks from the office. It was one of those places with a chalkboard menu and too many plants. We sat at a corner table, away from the windows. She looked tired, like someone who had been sleeping badly. She said that the office felt strange without me, that people were whispering about how fast everything was moving. She mentioned that some of the test environments were still showing odd behavior, but that when she raised it, Jonas told her to stop being negative. She worried that if something went wrong after the cutover, people like her would be blamed while the leaders found excuses. I listened and asked careful questions. I did not ask her to copy anything or break any rule. I only asked how the new platform connected to the old engine, which parts they planned to keep, which they would discard, and which safety checks they had turned off in the name of speed. She told me what she knew. It was enough to confirm what I had already suspected. They were walking away from the very conditions that had kept us safe. I told her she should keep her own notes, her own logs, and protect herself. I told her I would handle my side of things through proper channels. She looked at me with a mix of worry and hope and asked if I was angry. I said I was not angry, I was clear. There is a difference. After she left, I walked home instead of taking the train. The city felt different when you were no longer rushing back to a job that claimed your hours. At home, I went straight to my office again. On one shelf sat an old external hard drive, a small gray box with a cable wrapped around it. Next to it lay a smaller USB drive with a faded label, the ink almost gone. The label still showed part of the system's original code name, the one we used before marketing renamed it to something more dramatic. I picked up the USB drive, turned it in my fingers, and plugged it into my computer. The small light on its side blinked to life, steady and patient, as a folder appeared on my screen with a simple name, Foundations. When I opened the folder named Foundations, the past came back in small, neat files. There were early design diagrams, rough sketches, and old text documents with names like Risk Model V1 and Failover Shacked Notes. There were also copies of the original patent applications, saved as scans, each page stamped and formal. I scrolled through them slowly, remembering long nights at my old kitchen table before I joined the firm, when the engine was only an idea that lived in my head and on a second-hand laptop. Back then, nobody cared about my thoughts on safe trading architecture. People said I was overcomplicating things, said that existing systems were good enough. I had written the patents anyway, partly for protection, partly as a promise to myself that I would take safety seriously even if others did not. Now, years later, those same documents looked less like forgotten history and more like tools that still had work to do. I decided I would not guess about the legal side. Guessing is for people who want to feel powerful without understanding the risk. I was still an engineer. I understood that when something is outside your domain, you call someone whose domain it is. The next morning, I called my old lawyer. He was a calm man who had helped me with the patent filings long before this firm knew my name. When I told him I had been let go and that the company was rushing into a platform change that might violate the conditions of our old agreement, he did not sound surprised or excited. He simply said we should talk in person and that I should bring everything I had. His office sat on the 20th floor of a building across town, with a view of another part of the river and a quieter kind of glass. Inside, the waiting area was simple. A few chairs, a small table, law journals stacked in neat piles. In the meeting room, he spread my old folder out on the table, page by page, along with his own copies from years before. He asked me to explain, in simple words, what the firm was doing now. I told him about the new CEO, the push for speed, the removal of safety layers, and the rushed cutover plans. I told him about the test warnings Maya had seen and about the tone of the internal jokes about old systems and old guard engineers. He listened, took notes, and then walked me through the agreement line by line. There was a section describing how my architecture could be licensed under certain operational conditions. Another section explained that if those conditions were ignored in a way that created unreasonable risk, certain rights about use and support shifted. He said that in many cases, such clauses were never tested because both sides preferred to stay careful, but he made it clear that they were not symbolic. He said the firm had the right to build whatever new platform they wanted, but that if they still leaned on parts of my engine or my name while ripping out required protections, they might be stepping outside the license. I asked him what that meant in real life, not in abstract legal words. He said it meant that if they broke the safety rules baked into our agreement, I had the right to limit or withdraw their future use of my architecture and name under certain conditions. He said it did not mean I could or should make systems fail, and I told him I would never do that. It meant I did not have to stand by and let them risk everything while still pretending they were shielded by my work. It also meant that if clients or regulators later needed to know who warned whom about what and when, my record could matter. We agreed that I would gather a clear timeline of events, when warnings were raised, how the migration was planned, what safety features were disabled, and when I was removed. He said that if the firm's actions led to a serious failure while in that state, we could then decide how to act carefully within the law. Before I left, he asked me how I felt. I told him I felt like an engineer watching someone take bolts out of a bridge while telling the city it was safe. He said in that case, documenting every loose bolt would be wise. Over the next days, my home office became a quiet war room of paper and screens. I printed old emails where I had described critical safety features in simple terms for managers years ago. I looked through incident tickets where my recommendations prevented small problems from becoming big ones. I saved copies of internal newsletters where leaders praised the firm's flawless stability and attached graphs that my engine had made possible. I did not alter anything. I only collected pieces that already existed, arranging them by date in a sequence that told a clear story, how we had built safety and how recent decisions had chipped at it. I also wrote down my memory of key meetings with Aurora and Jonas, with dates and names. I described in plain language how I had warned about aggressive timelines and half-tested failover paths. I did not add dramatic flourishes. I just wrote what was said and who was in the room. When I was done, I had a simple, boring document that showed a straight line from caution to carelessness. My lawyer reviewed some of it and said it was good work, the kind of work judges and regulators like. Clean, factual, unemotional. One afternoon, I received a call from Priya. She sounded calm, but I could hear tension under her voice. She had heard, through the usual client channels, that I was no longer at the firm. She asked me privately why I had left. I told her that management had called my role redundant in the new structure and that there had been differences in how we saw risk. I did not badmouth anyone. I simply said that the new leadership had chosen speed and optics over the cautious, layered approach we had used for years. She asked if the platform was still safe. I told her that my old engine, as designed, was still safe, but that if they tore pieces out of it and mixed them with untested parts, nobody could promise anything. She invited me to visit her office. Just to talk, as she put it. Her conference room had a long table, a screen on the wall, and a view of her own team's trading area. She said her fund had stayed with us through rough times because the system had held. She remembered the early days when delays had kept her awake at night and how things had changed after my engine came online. Now, she said, they were hearing big promises about faster, shinier tools, but not seeing many details about risk. I reminded her that as a fiduciary, her first duty was to her own clients, not to any one firm. Without pushing, I explained, in simple pictures, what a multi-day freeze in trading would mean for a client like her. Missed opportunities, regulatory questions, angry phone calls she would have to answer. I told her I hoped nothing like that would ever happen. I also told her that, given what I had seen, I could not say it was impossible. She looked at me for a long moment, then said she wished the new leaders valued boring stability as much as she did. I replied that some lessons only sink in when they collide with reality. Before I left, she said that if anything serious ever did happen, she wanted to know my view directly, not through filtered reports. I nodded. Around the same time, I arranged to meet briefly with a senior contact at the regulator's office. We had built a relationship over years of honest conversations whenever something unusual happened. The meeting took place in the lobby cafe of a large stone building, not in some secret room. We sat at a table with paper cups of coffee while people came and went around us. I told him I was no longer with the firm and that I hoped their systems would stay steady. I also told him, in general terms, that there was a growing difference between public speeches about stability and private decisions about safety layers. I did not make any formal complaint. I did not show any internal documents. I simply said that if, in the near future, they saw a big freeze coming from that direction, it would not be a bolt from the blue, at least not for those who had been warned. He nodded slowly, said he appreciated context, and that sometimes the most valuable information comes before the forms, not after. Evenings with Oliver became a little different, too. I had more time at home than I had in years. We cooked simple dinners together, and he asked what I was going to do next. I told him I was taking a breath, looking at my options, and making sure the people who had depended on my work understood what was really holding them up. He asked if I was trying to get revenge. I said I was trying to protect myself and others in a way that respected the rules. I told him that feelings could make people do messy things, but that power built on clear agreements and truth lasted longer than anger. On my desk, small piles of paper turned into labeled folders. One held old patents and licensing agreements. Another held performance reports and risk memos. A third held notes from recent meetings and calls, including the town hall, the HR meeting, and the private conversations I had after. I was not planning an attack. I was building a simple story that could be told in front of anyone without shame. Each night when I turned off the desk lamp, the sight of those folders gave me a quiet sense of control, not over other people's choices, but over my own response to them. Then, one evening, my phone buzzed with a message from Maya. She said that the final cutover date had been confirmed once again, and that any remaining concerns were being labeled as negativity. She said internal tests still showed strange latency spikes and occasional stuck processes, but that Jonas had told the team to ignore minor warnings and focus on preparing for the big day. She wrote that Aurora had scheduled an all-hands war room and celebration session in the executive boardroom for the morning of the cutover. I read her message twice. The words war room and celebration sitting next to each other said more than she knew. It meant they expected both danger and applause at the same time. It meant they still thought they could surf risk and image in the same breath. I replied that she should keep her own records safe, that she should not let anyone pressure her into hiding real data, and that I would take care of my side of things through the proper channels. When I put the phone down, the room was very quiet. Outside, traffic made a distant, steady sound through the window glass. On my desk, the folders sat in a neat row. I looked at the old calendar from the office that I had brought home and saw the cutover date already circled from days ago. Now it was no longer just a circle on paper, it was a line on a countdown. A big event had been chosen as the stage. A boardroom full of glass and screens would soon hold people who believed they had moved past the need for old guard caution. Late that night, as I shut down my computer, a new message from Maya appeared on the screen. It was short. She wrote that the cutover would start early in the morning in 3 days, and that Aurora had just updated the invite with a confident note about closing the chapter on legacy systems for good. At the bottom of the invite, the location line read, "Executive Boardroom, all key stakeholders present." The days before the cutover felt like standing in a quiet hallway while a noisy party built on the other side of a closed door. I spent my mornings at the kitchen table with coffee, then moved to my home office and went through my notes again and again. I checked my timeline of warnings and decisions, making small corrections when I remembered a date more clearly or found an old email that shifted a detail. I was not trying to shape the story to make anyone look worse. I was trying to make it so clean that, if someone hostile read it, they would still have to admit it was true. That kind of clarity is slow work. I met my lawyer again, this time with my new folders arranged in order. He read parts in silence, one hand on his chin, and then asked calm questions. He wanted to know the names of everyone in each meeting, the subject lines of key emails, the exact words used when I raised concerns. He said that, if there was ever a dispute about who knew what, this level of detail would matter more than any speech. We spoke about what might happen if the firm pushed ahead, disabled safety layers, and then hit a serious failure. He reminded me that I could not and would not make such a failure happen. That was not who I was. But he also reminded me that if they walked the system into a wall, ignoring standards tied to my license, I did not have to stand under the rubble with them. He said he was preparing a narrow, precise set of steps he would take if certain conditions were clearly met, major outage, broken safety rules, and clear evidence that warnings had been ignored. He did not show me every legal detail. I did not ask. I trusted him to keep the line clean. On my way home from his office, I stopped at the river for a few minutes and watched the water move around the pillars of a bridge. Cars passed overhead, each driver thinking about something else entirely, trusting that someone, somewhere, had done the math and the maintenance. I had spent 12 years being that someone, somewhere, for trades instead of cars. Now, people who liked slogans more than math were adjusting the beams. There is a point where you accept that some crashes are not yours to prevent. The next day, Priya called again. She said there were more rumors in her circles about our firm's big upcoming modernization launch. She said some people spoke like it was a glamorous event, not a high-risk operation. We met once more in her conference room. She did not waste time. She asked me directly what she should do if the platform froze. I told her that my job was not to tell her how to run her fund. I told her that, in her place, I would have a plan ready before the freeze ever happened. She understood. She said she had already spoken with her own legal and operations people about fallback arrangements. She also said that, if the worst happened and she saw that leadership had lied or minimized the risk, she would not stay tied to them out of habit. I said calmly that I was in touch with my lawyer about my own rights, and that if things broke, I would not pretend I had no voice. She looked at me and said that if I ever led or oversaw a system again, she would want to hear about it first. I did not promise her anything. Promises made before impact are cheap. Instead, I said that if the day came when her trust and my work lined up again, I would make sure she heard from me directly. She walked me to the door and thanked me for my honesty. She said that even if nothing dramatic ever happened, she would rather have been nervous with real information than calm with lies. That, more than anything, reminded me why I still cared about this work. Back at home, evenings with Oliver felt strangely normal. We still cooked, watched a game, argued about whether a team's coach knew what he was doing. He asked if I had found a new job yet. I told him I was not rushing. I said I wanted to choose my next step with a clear mind, not out of fear. He asked again if what I was doing with lawyers and documents was revenge. I tried to explain it in terms he knew. I told him to imagine building a group project for school, something that carried the grades of many people. If later other students tore out the important parts and claimed the project was still safe because his name was on the cover, he would have the right to say that his name did not cover their new mess. I said this was like that, just with more zeros on the numbers. He nodded slowly and said he thought he understood. As the cutover date crept closer, messages from inside the firm took on a manic tone. Maya described long days, endless meetings, and leaders talking about owning the moment. She said Jonas was practicing speeches about how this launch would prove the firm had left the past behind. She said Aurora had added a line to her internal post about thanking those who had served in the old era while celebrating those brave enough to build the new one. It was a farewell disguised as praise. I told Maya to keep her head down, do her work right, and stay honest in her own records. I repeated that none of this was worth her losing her name over. She thanked me and said that sometimes the only thing keeping her grounded was remembering that someone outside still saw things clearly. My lawyer called one evening and said that, based on what we knew, he was ready for several possible paths. If nothing happened, my documents would sit quietly in his office. If a small issue arose and the firm handled it honestly, he would advise me to stay in the background. But if a serious outage hit while they were operating under unsafe conditions tied to my architecture, he would act without delay to protect my rights and reputation as soon as we had clear proof. He asked if I was comfortable with that plan. I said I was. It did not feel like a trap. It felt like a fire extinguisher, something you hope to never use but you still buy. The night before the cutover, I barely slept, but not because I was panicking. I moved between the kitchen and my office, checking small things, then sitting on the couch for a while, then getting up again. Oliver went to bed early for a school day, and at the door told me that whatever happened, he was proud that I had not begged to stay where I was not respected. That sentence stayed with me more than any praise I had ever heard from a boardroom. I told him that keeping your own line straight mattered more than keeping your chair. In the early hours of the cutover morning, the firm surprised me. Around dawn, my phone rang. The number belonged to Martin, the CFO. His voice sounded tired but precise. He said the board had asked him to reach out. They had heard concerns from a few directions, including some clients and possibly a regulator contact. They could not stop the cutover now without admitting weakness, but they wanted to know if I would be willing to come in as an external consultant, just in case things did not go as planned. He framed it carefully as a temporary, limited engagement. He said he understood that how they had handled my departure was not ideal. That was as close as he came to an apology. I thought about it for a moment. My lawyer had prepared me for this kind of call. Coming in as an external consultant did not take away any of my rights. In some ways, it made them clearer, because my new status and boundaries would be written in fresh ink. I told Martin I would come in under the condition that my role, responsibilities, and limits were defined in writing by my lawyer's office. He agreed faster than I expected. Within an hour, I had a short, clear document in my email from my lawyer, confirming that I was an independent consultant with no duty to hide past warnings or accept liability for decisions made after my termination. I read it twice, signed it digitally, and sent it back. As I dressed for the day, I chose a simple shirt and jacket, the same way I dressed during my old years at the firm. Nothing flashy, nothing dramatic. I was not going to a show. I was going to watch a structure take the weight it had been claiming it could handle. On the train, I watched people scroll on their phones, laugh at messages, fall asleep with heads tilted back. Somewhere above part of this line, the firm's building rose with its glass and slogans. In 3 days, they had moved from calling me old guard to calling me as backup. The irony sat in my chest like a small stone. When I stepped through the revolving doors again, the lobby felt strangely familiar and foreign at the same time. I checked in as a visitor. The security guard looked at my name on the screen, looked at my face, and raised his eyebrows slightly. He said that it had been a while. I replied that some systems had long memories. He printed a temporary badge and handed it to me. As I clipped it to my jacket, I felt my phone vibrate in my pocket. One vibration, then another, then a third, close together like someone knocking 3 times on a door. I stepped aside near a wall and pulled out the phone. 3 messages waited on the screen, each from a name that now lived in a separate folder in my mind. One from Maya, short and sharp, said that cutover had begun and that some processes felt slow already. One from Priya said that her fund had paused some non-critical trades, just in case, and that she hoped I was somewhere calm. One from my lawyer said that he had cleared his morning and that he would be available the moment I needed him. They all carried the same quiet meaning. Without any of them using the exact words, each message told me the same simple thing. It had started. The incident war room was set up in one of the larger conference spaces, just down the hall from the executive boardroom. When I walked in with my temporary badge, the walls were lined with screens showing dashboards, graphs, and long lists of red error messages. Phones rang constantly. People spoke in low, tense voices. A young analyst I barely recognized pointed me to a side table where a spare laptop waited for me. I logged in under a guest account and watched the live data. The picture was simple and ugly. Orders were queuing up without execution. Some partial paths worked, then froze. Fallback routines that should have moved flows back to stable ground were either misconfigured or completely disabled. The system was not dead, exactly. It was stuck in a pattern that left traders helpless and clients furious. Jonas stood near the front, sleeves rolled up, talking into a headset and staring at a central screen. When he saw me, his eyes flicked over me, then back to the monitor, like he needed a second to decide which emotion to show. Aurora was not in the war room. She was where image lives, in the boardroom with the directors and key clients on screens. Someone said she was managing communications. That meant she was trying to control the story while the system refused to move. The room felt thick with nerves and blame, even before anyone said the word. I asked for a copy of the cutover plan and the current configuration. A frazzled engineer pulled up documents and diagrams. I traced the lines with my finger on the screen, following the paths orders took through the new platform. Here was where a safety check used to be. Here was where a fallback path toward the old engine had been removed for the sake of speed. Here was where they had changed a rule set that had stayed untouched for 10 years. None of this surprised me. It simply confirmed the pattern. I asked a few questions, wrote down times and values, and then stepped out into the hallway. Martin met me there, his tie slightly loose, his face drawn but composed. He asked in a flat voice how bad I thought it was. I told him the truth, that the freeze could last hours or days if they kept trying to patch it in place, and that the damage to trust was already spreading faster than any fix. He closed his eyes for a moment and then said the board wanted to hear directly from me. He led me to the boardroom doors. Through the glass, I saw Eleanor at the head of the table, several directors seated around, and screens on the wall showing remote members and key clients, including Priya. Aurora stood near one end, speaking with her hands, a slide behind her displaying talking points about unexpected vendor behavior. When I entered, the room shifted. Conversations dropped. Heads turned. Aurora paused, mid-sentence, and said my name like a question. Eleanor looked at me with a tired, sharp gaze and invited me to sit at the table. I did not sit. I remained standing at the end nearest the screens, where everyone could see me and the documents in my hands. Martin said that in light of the current outage and the growing concern from clients, the board had asked me to explain what was happening and whether it could have been avoided. I spoke the way I always had, in simple, clear sentences. I explained that the new platform had been brought online with key safety layers removed or disabled. I reminded them that the original engine had been designed with those layers as non-negotiable parts of its operation. I described, without drama, how warnings had been raised about aggressive timelines and incomplete tests, and how those warnings had been brushed aside. I did not insult anyone. I did not raise my voice. I laid out a timeline, dates of meetings, subjects of emails, names of people present when concerns were voiced. Then I took out a folder and placed it gently on the table. I opened it and slid a set of documents toward Eleanor and Martin. These were copies of my original patent filings and the licensing agreement that had allowed the firm to use my architecture. I pointed to one section that described the safety conditions under which my design could be used as part of a trading platform. I pointed to another that explained what would happen if those conditions were deliberately removed or ignored. My lawyer appeared on a screen at the far end of the room, calm and professional, and confirmed that, based on the current configuration and the outage, those conditions had indeed been broken. He explained, in legal language translated into plain terms, that as of the moment the firm chose to operate under this risky configuration, I had the right to limit their future use of my engine and my name. He added that this did not mean I would block an emergency stabilizing action now. On the contrary, I was willing to advise on immediate steps to get trades moving again in a safe way. But he made it very clear that once the crisis was contained, the broad license they had enjoyed for years would not simply continue as if nothing had happened. On the wall, Priya spoke up. Her face was steady, but there was anger in her voice. She said her fund had already paused as many trades as they could, that they were explaining the outage to their own clients, and that this was the first time in years they had felt this level of helplessness with our systems. She said that under no circumstances would her fund remain with a platform led by people who ignored the engineer who kept it safe and then pushed him out. She said that if I chose to lead or oversee any future system, they would move their flow there as soon as it was ready. The room went very quiet. Jonas started to speak, something about unforeseeable vendor issues. But one of the directors cut him off and asked him directly whether he had disabled the fallback paths I had designed. He hesitated for one beat too long. That was enough. Aurora tried to steer the conversation back to messaging and recovery plans, but the tone in the room had shifted. This was no longer a story about a brave modernization that hit a surprise bump. It was a story about leadership that had gambled with the core engine and lost. Eleanor looked at the documents in front of her, then at the faces on the screens, then at me. She asked one last question, whether I was willing to help stabilize the situation today under the conditions described by my lawyer and then step back while the board decided what to do next. I said yes. I told her I would not let my pride make clients suffer more than they already had. I added that once the system was safe, I would exercise my rights fully and that I would not return to any arrangement where my work was used as a shield for careless decisions. She nodded slowly and then turned her head toward Aurora and Jonas. Her voice was very soft when she said that their positions and decisions would be reviewed effective immediately. Security appeared in the glass reflection of the hallway as two silhouettes. My lawyer ended the call after confirming our next steps. I placed my temporary badge on the table beside the old licensing papers, a small plastic square next to 12 years of ink, and walked out of the boardroom into the hallway, leaving behind the sound of hushed arguments and the glow of red dashboards that were finally beginning to shift toward motion again.